I don't want no oil, a spoil in my shoreline. I like fish much better than crud. I like birds and things, a-creeping and crawling. Won't trade no more oil for blood. The sun done give us all we need to make this country run. But that black demon oil's got us fussing and fighting, and I do believe it's time we was done. I don't want them nukes run by them kooks who think radioactivity is fun. No more three-headed frogs or kids with leukemia. Nuclear power ain't fit for a dog. The sun done give us all we need to make this country run. But that nuclear power's got us fussing and fighting, and I do believe it's time we was done. No nukes!
Good morning, Toledo, and good afternoon, Columbus. Good evening, Bowling Green, and hello to everyone on the internet, wherever and whenever you may be. My name is Joe DeMar, and I am about to produce an incredible hour of radio called For a Green Future. For a Green Future is a show where we talk about ecology and the environment. And we talk about them in the ways that they affect you, your wealth, your health, your happiness, the wealth and health and happiness of your friends and your families and your coworkers and your pets and the bugs that are buzzing around, the mayflies and the fish that eat the mayflies and the birds that eat the fish, and basically everyone and everything, because, like it or not, all of us are wrapped up together here on this wonderful planet called Earth. And we have a wonderful show lined up for you today. It's, of course, a very special day. It's Father's Day. And I have this pre-recorded this show because, unfortunately, I can't be live in the studio because if everything goes according to plan, right now I'm on a remote island out in Lake Michigan doing some primitive camping. So that's not a bad Father's Day for me. I kind of like that. But there's, of course, a lot going on in the world. I have to record this basically on Thursday before Father's Day. So I'm recording this before the huge nationwide protests on Saturday the 14th. So I have no idea how those went. But I'm guessing they were fine. I'm guessing that there were millions and millions of people out peacefully protesting. And you'll know better when you hear the show. But I wanted to focus on the fact that there's so much going on right now. There's so many crises that we're being faced with. And I wanted to focus on the fact that we can't forget that the environment, the ecology, is at the base of all these crises. Basically, the way we treat the Earth, the health of the planet, dictates and drives everything else. So, for example, one of the main reasons we're having some protests around the country is that ICE, the Immigration Enforcement Agency, is arresting lots of immigrant workers. And a lot of those immigrant workers came to the U.S. from Central America. And the reason a lot of them came, especially in the last 5 years, is very directly related to climate. They had some really large hurricanes down there, and those hurricanes displaced, that is, ruined the houses of like 1.5 million people. That was back in 2020. We're talking about Hurricanes Eta and Iota. So 1.5 million people found themselves without homes, and it was very difficult for them economically to try to rebuild because a lot of those countries don't have the economic reserves necessary to just, the way we do in the U.S., loan people new money and have them build new houses. So a lot of those people are now up in the U.S. trying to earn a living, working, many of them without paper, without documentation, and so subject to being arrested and deported. And it wasn't just the two hurricanes. That area, Central America, El Salvador, Nicaragua, all those places where so many people have emigrated from, they've had a series of fires and droughts and floods. And in some places, they've lost as much as 70% of their agricultural crop. So again, farmers being wiped out and having no recourse to build, no access to capital, no way to restart their farms. And so many of them coming to the U.S. is kind of the last resort for survival. And, so this is kind of a positive feedback loop in terms of disasters creating human crises, social and economic crises, which in turn can lead to more environmental disasters because there's, more stress on the land, more demand on the land. And even we do well to remember that even in places like Ukraine, where they're having that big war right now, that war is an environmental and ecological disaster too, because there's nothing that puts more carbon in the air than a war. A big SUV gets maybe 8 miles to the gallon. A big tank gets 8 gallons to the mile. And not to mention all the resources that are going into producing these weapons of war, many of which are being produced literally just in order to be destroyed as soon as they're put on the battlefield. The amount of military hardware and infrastructure that's being blown up over there is just incredible, just astronomical. And we actually got a little taste of that here in Ohio this past week. There's a plant called the Austin Powder Plant. No, not the Austin Powers plant, the Austin Powder Plant. And that's down there in Vinton County in a little town called Zaleski. And it's a munitions plant that makes the explosives that go into artillery shells and things of that nature. And they had a big industrial accident. They had nitric acid, or actually it was nitric oxide that leaked into the atmosphere, and once it got into the atmosphere, it combined with to form nitric acid, and so they had to evacuate tens of thousands of people in the surrounding county. And it's just a reminder that the costs of war are borne everywhere, both in economic terms and in environmental and ecological terms, because that's a big, pollutant, and that toxic fumes, people evacuated. There was no reported human casualties, but nobody told the animals. Nobody told the raccoons and the eagles and the critters down there. So with a plume of that size, there were wildlife fatalities, I'm sure. But we often talk about positive feedback loops in this show, in terms of especially global warming, in terms of carbon dioxide causing global warming, and then the global warming in turn causing more carbon dioxide, which produces more global warming, et cetera, et cetera. So we've talked about that a lot. But there are also positive feedback loops that are good. And I guess the best example of that, and we'll have some information on that during our ecological news segment. Oh, I haven't actually described what the show is yet. Oh, man. So, this little portion here where we're just chatting, that's going to last another 5 minutes or so. Then we will be hearing from our special guest. We did an interview with a fellow named Gary Hauser, who is somebody who's been working on climate issues in Ohio for many years. Then we'll hear from our wonderful advertisers and patrons. And then Rebecca will be giving us a little interview on a special environmental topic. And then it'll be ecological news from around the world. And like I say, we've got some good news, we've got some not so good news, but it's all interesting. And I've always tried to pick out the news that has the most import long term, the news that kind of indicates trends and shows the direction that the world is going. And we are going. We're all going in this together. So, anyway, I was talking about positive feedback loops and how it is actually possible for positive feedback loops to be positive, to help us. And specifically, I'm talking about how we're switching over to a carbon-free society. That is, wind and solar and battery storage have been getting more practical and cheaper. And so it's the positive feedback loop there is practicality and expense. Because as we build more batteries and solar panels and wind turbines, the mass production cost and the cost of those things goes down. And that makes them more practical to choose when you're trying to invest in an energy source that you're building. And so that causes more demand, or that causes us to build more. And as we build more, we find more efficient techniques, and the process gets simpler. Companies compete against each other to make the cheapest and the best, and so the cost goes down. And so that's the positive loop there with carbon-free energy technology. Batteries, wind turbines, and solar panels have all been caught in these positive feedback loops in that they continue to get cheaper. They continue to be the first choice when people are making a new energy policy or a new energy installation. And so that is a very positive development, globally speaking. Now, here in Ohio, of course, we are a special case because here our state and local governments, which are overwhelmingly controlled by Republicans, okay, let's just say this, it's true, and those Republicans are overwhelmingly opposed to wind and solar energy. And so what they've been doing, they've been deliberately trying to stop the positive feedback loop. They've been stepping in and using the powers of the state to both make it more expensive, in that they're both statewide and nationally, the Republicans are trying to get rid of any sort of federal subsidies for green energy, for wind and solar power, while increasing subsidies for dirty energy, for nuclear and coal and natural gas. And so that is a big negative development there. And another point of weakness, another point they're attacking the wind and solar industry here in Ohio is with siting, just letting them build a wind farm or a solar farm. And so our guest today, Gary Hauser, has been looking at this problem, and he's written a couple articles and done some research, basically taking the Ohio Power Siting Board to task for changing the state policy so that just a couple, like county level people or city or township level people, politicians specifically, can stop an entire project that an entire community really wants, but with just essentially a few very easily influenceable, I'm going to actually say corruptible political people in a few places. They're able to block thousands of people from benefiting from wind and solar power. So let's go to the interview now and get a little more detail from Gary Hauser. Hello and welcome to For a Green Future. Could you please share with us your name and who you're with?
Yes, my name is Gary Hauser, and I'm with the Solar Committee of Third Act Ohio. Folks who have followed the climate issue at all within the last 15 years will probably recognize the name 350.org. This was the largest grassroots climate movement in the country. It was founded by Bill McKibben, and it kind of became much more well known, broke into media coverage when it organized several civil disobedience campaigns in regard to the Keystone Pipeline. But the Third Act Ohio was something that evolved out of the larger 350.org. It's primarily organized to people who are a little bit older. The older generation in the climate movement have now consolidated themselves within what's called Third Act, which is active in all 50 states. I'm involved with the Ohio chapter. And a little quick background on myself. I have produced several videos that were used by 350.org over the years, and I also was the first, I was a successful advocate of the first really large solar array in southeast Ohio. And I was involved with a ballot measure in Columbus that now requires electricity to increasingly come from renewable sources. It's called green aggregation, passed a few years ago. And I'll talk about that a little bit later, but it's a great tool. I hope your audience will want to learn more about.
Okay. So, I've invited you on the show today because you've been writing about the fate of solar power in Ohio for a while now. And there's two specific articles you wrote, one on March 13th about the Grange project, and one on March 20th in Ohio Capital Journal about the current state of the Ohio Supreme Court case that I think it's important for our listeners to know about. So, first, let's talk about the Grange project. The title of your article was Why is Ohio Board Overriding a 4-to-1 Public Majority on a Local Sheep Grazing Project? So tell us about Grange Solar and what happened to it.
Sure. I think the place to start is to look at how the opposition to solar projects uh, do their own organizing, and then kind of take it from that point. What they tend to do is to study a particular area, what kind of issue is something that would resonate with the local community, an issue that they might be able to seize on and be able to use as a weapon, basically, to, to oppose the solar project. And what they did in the Grange project is they found out that people were concerned about a perceived loss of agricultural land, having that land being taken up by solar panels instead of growing crops. And so they very much seized on that, and they tried to make that an issue by which to defeat the solar project. But in this particular case of the Grange, the developers were already on to the strategy, and right from the get-go, they designed a component called agrovoltaics, which it's kind of a fancy word, but it just means using solar panels and continuing to to maintain the agricultural use of the land at this very same time, that there's no conflict between the two. And so right from the beginning of Grange, they designed it so the land around the solar panel, below and around the panels, would be grazed by sheep. And the sheep would be part of an agricultural operation and very much maintained that type of use of the land. So they were taking that argument away from the opposition. But and what's interesting is that because they did so, they were actually able to gain a strong majority in the public comments that were made to the Ohio Power Siting Board. The solar developer took its own count, and they found that 80% of the comments were coming in favor of Grange. And so the fact that it was still rejected, I think, was something that speaks volumes about what's happening in the solar sector in Ohio, because they they've they've taken this very arcane rule from the past about gaining the involvement of local officials, but they've magnified it into something that would become the deciding factor in any decision about solar projects. In other words, if just a handful of local officials came out in opposition to a project, basically that's what the siting board is going to go with. It doesn't matter if even a majority of the public wants a project to happen, they are going to reject it because of the local officials. And it's also, I think, a legitimate question to ask here that since the Grange project happened to be located in the home district of Senate President Rob McCauley, who was the primary sponsor of SB 52, which is a blatantly anti-solar piece of legislation passed several years ago, I don't think there's any coincidence that there was major pressure brought on those local officials in that particular district in order to defeat this project.
So the project was defeated, it's been withdrawn. And you mentioned how well organized the anti-solar contingent or forces are down there. I understand they actually bought a local newspaper.
Yeah, this is we talked about the project in Grange, but the story about the Fraser Solar Project in Knox County, a separate project, is is totally unbelievable when you really get to the details. Um, but the first thing to say about Grange is that the strategy was based on simply locking up the local officials, getting to them ahead of time and locking them up in opposition to the project, and the opponents knew they would be able to win on that basis. But in the Fraser case, there was a different strategy. It was still based on the idea of manipulating the issue of losing agricultural land, but it was just blatantly uh, orchestrated by the fossil fuel industry itself. I mean, they were not even trying to hide anything in Knox County. Um, the There's a local fossil fuel corporation called the Ariel Corporation. It's based right in Mount Vernon, Knox County, and they formed a group called Knox Smart Development. That was kind of like their front group that they operated with, and they got funding from the corporation and other fossil fuel interests to just saturate that community with anti-solar information, which included, as you stated, the purchase of the local newspaper. I mean, they basically stopped at nothing in order to get their distorted perspective across to the community. And they organized what they called a town hall in Mount Vernon. They rented an extremely lavish theater for who knows how much money. They brought in a speaker all the way from Chicago, from a place called the Heartland Institute. And if anybody's heard that name before, they are famous for being the institute that came in to assist the tobacco industry when it was trying to continue to justify the selling of cigarettes and downplay the fact that they were dangerous and can cause cancer. This was the group they brought in order to distort that information for the tobacco industry. The very same group was they paid for their services to come to Mount Vernon and give a presentation to present the climate issue as a total hoax, just as Donald Trump claims, a total hoax. This was the theme of the whole town hall, and the town hall concept originated in New England, and it was something that was used as what was called the most pure form of democracy, to give local people a chance to come to a town hall meeting and everybody express their views democratically, pro or con on an issue. Everybody had a right to speak. And yet, at this thing that was called a town hall in Mount Vernon, uh, the leader of the solar group, the solar development group, which is called Open Road Renewables, attempting to build the Fraser project, came to the town hall and attempted to speak in favor of the project, and he was turned away, not even allowed to come into the building.
So in the May 20th article, you said that the quote, exorbitantly wealthy fossil fuel industry in Ohio is seeking to halt solar farms because they're competition, unquote. So um, that kind of describes what they're doing. What other things led you to this
Yeah.
conclusion?
Well, just like I say, the story of what happened in Knox County,
Yeah.
I think is a good answer as anybody could provide to that question to show just how fiercely they are working to shut down solar in Ohio. Um, I
Okay.
could give other examples, and as we get into the Supreme Court decision, I will also share other examples of that.
Well, let's go to that question now. So, the Ohio Supreme Court's considering giving the authority to stop future solar projects to a small handful of local officials. Doesn't that conflict with Ohio's siting laws that specify there's no, quote, local jurisdiction, unquote?
Most definitely, yes. In fact, this case, which I should explain, was brought by a solar developer called Vesper Energy, and it was in regard to the rejection of one of their solar projects in southwest Ohio called Kingwood Solar. And this case has already had oral arguments presented, I think about 2 months ago. So right now they're in the stage of deliberating over a verdict. But during those oral arguments, this was specifically brought up by the attorney for Kingwood Solar, and they pointed out that this is a contradictory to what the laws are about not allowing a local jurisdiction to block a solar project. It's supposed to be done at the state level, not the local level. And he pointed out how the Ohio Power Siting Board was basically taking the law into its own hands and essentially rewriting the law so it would be have this different interpretation of allowing local officials to have more authority than anybody else. So this was brought up in the case, and hopefully the Kingwood Solar side is going to prevail, but we can only see what happens on that. Ohio is not just any state. Ohio happens to be the fifth largest producer of carbon emissions in the entire country. So what we do in Ohio does make a difference. And if we were to be able to unleash the solar power projects in this state, it was something that would have nationwide significance, even global significance, because Ohio is such a big producer of carbon emissions. But the tragedy is that this whole process is going in the opposite direction, the precise opposite. And to me, I see this as an abdication of our moral responsibility to future generations to allow this travesty to be happening in Ohio. If compared to all the other states, I'm not sure there's any other state where the fossil fuel industry is exerting more power and their big money in order to bring down solar than the state of Ohio. And I really appeal for people to notice that this is happening and get involved and try to stop it. There's such a thing as a tipping point. There is a point where the breakdown of life support systems on Earth is not going to just go down gradually, but it's going to basically go over the edge of a cliff. Um, there's several tipping points that once they start to happen, they all begin to interplay with each other, and the whole system begins to spin out of control. And the scientists are talking about extremely grave consequences for planet Earth. Um, so along the lines of, right now we're at 1.5 degrees of, of extra heating. If it gets anywhere close to extra 3 degrees centigrade, they're talking about basically a band forming along the equator of the Earth that will just become superheated to the point where it becomes uninhabitable. It'll become called a dead zone because it will not support life. And that dead zone will begin spreading to the north, spreading to the south, cause massive droughts, putting tens of millions of people on the edge of starvation because of the collapse of the food supply, and doesn't stop there at the equator. These dead zones begin moving further north and further south. It's eventually going to be affecting hundreds of millions of people. So we're talking about consequences on a scale that's almost unimaginable. And there needs to be a better effort from the climate movement to get this across to the general public. It's the fact that the Trump administration right now is being allowed to just decimate all the climate legislation, and there's not a strong enough counter voice to speak up against that. To me, is just it's not acceptable, and we've got to work harder on that. A very key point that was brought out in that Supreme Court case is that there are 8 criteria that a solar project needs to meet in order to be approved by the Ohio Power Siting Board. And in the case of Kingwood, um, they had met they met 7 out of the 8 criteria. The only one remaining was the one called public interest of the state. They had met 7 of the 8, leaving that one. And so for that one criteria of public interest, the Power Siting Board decided to give all weight to the handful of local officials and rejected that project. And what the attorneys stated, and I want to quote Chris Tavener, is the attorney for the Ohio Environmental Council, and he came out with a very cogent statement. I think the board needs to actually weigh reasons for opposition. The mere existence of opposition or support shouldn't be enough. So what happened in Kingwood on all the issues of substance, we should have prevailed. That project should have been approved. But because there was no value given to that compared to the opinion of local officials, it was voted down by the board. This is completely out of balance there. That decision never should be made. There should be reasons of substance that they are rejecting a solar project, not simply because local officials said no to it. Yeah, I just want to speak as highly as I can about a concept called green aggregation. To me, this is a fantastic tool. It was used in Columbus. We put a proposal on the ballot that required the whole city of Columbus to begin shifting towards sources of green energy to supply its electricity. And this is something that can be exported to any city in the entire state of Ohio. And it would be wonderful to see this happening all over the state, having people putting these proposals on their ballot and give citizens a chance to vote in a requirement that the electricity that they use in their city begin to come from sources of green energy. So I just want to put that out there to your audience.
That was our interview with Gary Hauser. I hope you found it informative, if not enjoyable. But luckily, it is time to do something enjoyable, and that is go to our advertisers and patrons. For a Green Future is brought to you by the Wood County Park District. Imagine a place where nature meets adventure, where you can climb, paddle, fish, and explore. That place, it's right here in Wood County. The Wood County Park District is here to protect, preserve, and inspire. We conserve natural and cultural treasures so you can enjoy the outdoors like never before. By maintaining green spaces, providing fun programs, restoring wildlife habitats, and leading outdoor adventures. Want to connect with nature? Try your hand at archery, bouldering, geocaching, paddling, rappelling, and more. Whether you're seeking an experience or a peaceful retreat, our parks are open every day from 8 a.m. to 30 minutes past sunset all year round. Come and explore. Get outside. Experience nature. Your parks, your adventures, waiting for you. Find us online at wcparks.org, or you can follow on Instagram, Facebook, or X, or you can call 419-353-1897. The Wood County Park District, preserving nature, creating adventures, and inspiring a greener future. The For a Green Future is also brought to you by our patrons. And those are wonderful people who've gone to patreon.com. That's Patreon. There they search for a Green Future. Up popped our Patreon page. And before you knew it, they were signed up to give a little bit of money out of their accounts every month and have it come over to us. And that's really how we can afford to keep this show on the air. So thank you so much to our patrons. We're very, very grateful. And another thing we're grateful for is our co-host, Rebecca. And so she'll be talking to us a little bit about mushrooms. Rebecca, what have you got for us this week?
Okay, well, one of this upcoming Sunday, I believe, is Father's Day.
Yeah, this show will be
And
airing on Father's Day.
right. So one of the stories that my dad always told me about, his father died when he was young, when he was only, I think, 5 or 6 years old.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that about his dad was that he used to like to go out in the woods with him in central Michigan, and his dad would get all excited if he found like an unusual fungus or something.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought, in honor of Dad and Grandpa Stanley,
Uh-huh.
I would do a fungus which might be found, for example, in the central Michigan woods. And one of them I came up with was chicken of the woods,
Okay.
the fungus. It's called Lady Porus. That it's a whole genus of edible, the different, mostly edible fungi, and it grows in shelves and florets, orange and yellow in color. And oops, it grows on trees and has a meaty texture and is edible if cooked. Although some people may be sensitive to it, so don't go crazy the first time somebody gives you chicken in the woods, chicken of the woods. Um, so yeah, the shelves or florets look frilly. I've seen these and it looks super weird. It's just this giant sort of like can pantalettes of bright orange frills. It's crazy. Raw consumption can cause intestinal issues. So if you eat the stuff raw or insufficiently cooked, you can sound the way that I do all the time. No matter what food you give me, virtually. It has a lemony flavor like chicken or lobster or crab, I am told. And bad news, it has a lot of non-edible lookalikes. So take an expert. Don't go picking it yourself off of trees. It's not good. The older specimens can also be ground into a flavoring powder that people use in risotto, for example. And specimens have been found weighing over 100 pounds in some parts of the world.
Yeah.
And the primary species in Michigan is Laetiporus sulphureus, sulfur chicken of the woods, I guess. And it grows on oak and other hardwood trees. And let's see, for the ecological stuff about it, its benefits are mostly that it decomposes wood. Thereby returning the nutrients to the ecosystem and also creating nesting cavities for other wildlife in dead logs and so forth. One drawback is it can be parasitic on live trees, on healthy trees. It can cause brown rot, which makes the wood brittle and makes them fall over during storms. Or it can be, this is my new word of the week, saprophytic on dead trees and dead logs, which means it eats dead tissue, basically. So, it can weaken a tree that's healthy, which is, so don't feel bad about eating them. They're probably parasitizing at some poor tree. But yeah, they also, another danger is that they can absorb and concentrate pesticides if they're close to farm fields at all. And then, the mushroom might be perfectly safe, but the pesticides will get you. Some threats to them include basically anything that weakens the woods weakens them. So any threats to forest, invasive species and disease can affect the host trees. Both of which are promoted by warmer temperatures because they favor invasives. Also, drought stress. Drought stress is a serious problem. And one of their poisonous lookalikes for my zinger fact is something called a jack-o'-lantern fungus.
Interesting.
Which is also, I'm guessing, it sounds orange and fancy looking. So
it does sound orange.
Yeah, you got to be real careful with these things, and you bring somebody with a botany degree or something. They're a little bit scary, unless you've been doing this all your life and really know what you're doing.
They are good though. I've eaten them. They're served in actually some of our local kind of upscale restaurants. They're so
nice, very nice. Okay,
a lot of the fancier restaurants around Toledo buy mushrooms from, field mushroom people up in Michigan. So that's great.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks very much, Rebecca.
You're welcome.
Any other comments for our Father's Day show before I go on to ecological news?
I guess not. I hope that Grandpa Stanley would have found this week's short segment interesting.
Now it's time for ecological news from around the world. Our first story is Solar Power World on June 9th, 2025. And this supports basically what we were talking about with our interview with Gary Hauser. The title is Labor Leaders Speak Out Against Ohio County's Ban on Proposed 400 Megawatt Solar Project. And what we're doing is down there in Crawford County. They had a big public meeting because there was a project proposed. It's called Wombat Solar, and as the title says, it's 400 megawatts. And they had a public meeting, and 100 people came to the meeting, and they spoke out in favor of the project, 3-1. And because it was going to create millions of dollars of annual revenue for the local school districts and for local businesses, it's going to put a lot of people to work. In fact, there were 3 unions, the International Union of Operating Engineers, IBEW 688, and the International Union of North America, all spoke out in favor of it because Wombat Solar had agreed to use union labor to build this solar field. And the county commissioners voted it down. They just said no, and they didn't provide any explanation. And this would have been very easily, Wombat Solar would have become the largest taxpayer in the county. It would have, significantly improved the economic condition down there in Crawford County. But once again, we find a small handful of elected officials. That's all it takes to influence, perhaps with campaign donations, perhaps with less savory methods. And they rejected something that would have been good for everybody. So, next story, and this story comes to us from Miami, Florida. We're off to sunny Miami, Florida. Unfortunately, the situation is that Miami's drinking water has been threatened by a Florida nuclear plant. This is a story in Bloomberg on June 6th. And what this has happened is the Turkey Point nuclear plant is leaking tritium, radioactive tritium, and hypersaline water into the local water table. See, what happened was they went and built this nuclear plant down there, Turkey Point, and the way they designed it, they dumped, the way most nuclear plants do, they dumped the waste heat from the plant into the nearest water, into the ocean outside of Miami. And essentially, because the water there is already warm, adding the hot water from the nuclear plant was cooking everything. It was killing everything in the bay. And so what they did was they designed these canals, and now they dump the heated wastewater into these canals, which are a dead-end canal. They're just there to cool the water. The problem is, anybody with basic science education knows that if you have salty water and you evaporate it because it's hot, the salt stays behind. And so what's been happening over the decades is the waters in this canal keep getting saltier and saltier. In fact, they have become hypersaline, as it's called, and they leak out of the canals now and down into the water table, and that is threatening the drinking water for all of the city of Miami. And the article doesn't dwell on this. It mentions this, but it says that the water is also contaminated with tritium, radioactive tritium, which has a half-life of about 100 years. It has a half-life of about 10 years. It takes about 100 years for tritium to disappear from the water table. But the tritium keeps building up. It's dangerous. You drink it, you can get cancer. And so they have a problem of both hypersalinity and cancer. And they're proposing all these outrageous engineering tricks to try to keep the water from the nuclear plant from contaminating the aquifer. But of course, it would be much simpler to just shut the nuclear plant and use solar energy in the sunshine state. So that's that story. Next story. And here we're going to staying down south, we're going to Louisiana. And this is a really intense story down there. Title, Unexpected Shutdown at St. Francisville Nuclear Plant, Partially to Blame for Massive NOLA outage. NOLA meaning New Orleans outage. Story was May 26th, and what happened down there is they had a nuke plant, they had a nuke plant that crashed. The St. Francisville nuclear plant crashed, and it brought down the regional grid because they actually have two nuke plants down there. One of them was already shut down for quote-unquote maintenance. And so when the second one shut down, it created a huge gap. Whenever you go from having a gigawatt of power to zero in a few seconds, it puts a strain on the grid. And the mid interior system operator that controls the grid from all the way from Louisiana up through Canada realized that they had to black out 100,000 people, about 50,000 of them in New Orleans and the other 50,000 in surrounding areas, or they risked crashing the entire grid. They could have, if they had tried to keep the power on there, they would have lost power over the entire middle of the continent. And so what happened is, they was a feed water failure, which is the water going in to keep the plant cool, and that prompted the crash, and the crash created the blackout, and the rest, as they say, is history. So remember, in the United States, a nuclear plant crashes about once every week. They have about a little more than 50 nuclear plant crashes every year, and this one was just a little more serious than usual. Next story, going to science.org. This is June 6th, 2025. U.S. military trims access to its critical sea ice measurements. So some of you may recall that during the presidential campaign, President Trump said, well, all we have to do is stop looking at global warming and it'll go away. In other words, stop taking the data. And it looks like that's exactly what they've started doing as policy, because these satellites from the military were used to measure Arctic sea ice, and the Arctic sea ice is approaching a record low. Okay, basically the peak in March was 80,000 square kilometers less than the peak in March of 2024, and that's the size of South Carolina. So there was South Carolina's less worth of ice at the North Pole up in the Arctic back in March, and March is the peak. March is when there's the most ice there is, and the trough, the end, comes in late in the summer, like in August, and it looks like we're not going to have data from the U.S. government for August. So this is really thrown a loop for the National Snow and Ice Data Center. They also are hurting because their funding was cut by NOAA, and so what they're doing, they're trying to turn to other satellites from other countries. There's some satellites from Japan, Europe, and China. They're kind of trying to use their data to keep reporting on the ice extent. And there is a brand new satellite in the Defense Department. It's called the Weather Systems Follow-On Microwave Satellite, but the Defense Department has refused to share any of that data with the public. And so basically what the situation is, it's the monkey with the hands over the eyes, see no evil. So Trump is trying to literally blind the scientists so they can't keep reporting on the fact that the globe is heating up, ice caps are shrinking, and we're all well on our way to being cooked. Okay, unfortunately, we're going to move on here. Just two more stories here. One is phys.org, and this was June 6, 2025. Methane leaks from dormant oil and gas wells in Canada are 7 times worse than thought, study suggests. In other words, there's 425,000 abandoned methane wells in Canada because they have a huge natural gas industry, and they're constantly abandoning wells because they're thinking they're not productive enough. And so what these scientists did was they went and actually measured the methane coming off of them. They measured the methane on 494 of those 425,000 so 0.1%. And they found that the amount of actual methane being put into the air was 230 kilotons, and that's 230,000 metric tons, and that is 7 times the official number that the government has estimated of only 34 kilotons. And the reason this makes a difference, of course, is that Canada, like many other countries, is claiming that they're going to try to meet the Paris Accords and get to net zero carbon, but you're not going to get there physically or actually if you're underestimating how much pollution you're putting out by a factor of 7. So they did find that there's a few wells that put out the most methane. In other words, the average well wasn't putting out that much, but a few of them were putting out just immense amounts. And the biggest difference they found, it wasn't based on geology. It wasn't based on where the wells were physically. What mattered was the regulations in each of the Canadian provinces. In other words, the Canadian provinces that had strong regulations about how to shut down wells and test for leaking methane, those places had much less methane than the deregulated Canadian provinces that basically let the industry do whatever it wants, which is, of course, the new Trump mantra. Final story. So I want to end on an upbeat note. This is renewables now, and it was actually, this story was all the way back in January 24th. And what's happening is they are creating they're on their way to creating a brand new renewable energy system that will be 70 gigawatts. In other words, 70 nuclear power plants worth of wind and solar in one development, the largest in the world. And this is called the Western Green Energy Hub, and it's a mix of wind, solar, storage with batteries, and hydrogen production. So what they're expecting is that they're going to combine 35 solar farms with 60 million solar panels, 3,000 wind turbines, and they'll be able to generate 3.5 million tons of hydrogen every year. And they're expecting this to take about 50 years to build completely, but it'll be mostly online in less than 30 years. It'll cover an area of 22,000 square kilometers, and where the project is right now is they've started the environmental impact study, which is something that the current administration is trying to short circuit here in the U.S. It's too bad that basically we're being short-circuited on environmental stuff, and environmental stuff is the first step in many countries, and well, it should be. So good luck to those folks down in Australia, very ambitious, planning the largest solar field, the largest renewable energy development in history, and it couldn't come quickly enough. So that's it for our show. Once again, happy Father's Day. And, I'm a father, and I'm very grateful to have 2 wonderful sons. And, just congratulations to all the fathers out there that are taking care of their boys and trying to take care of the environment, because that's part of taking care of your children, is taking care of the world that supports them. That's it for this week. We'll be back live next week. You'll be able to call in again, so get those phone calls ready.
I've got about 5 minutes left of the show, and so I want to take just a bit to talk about where I'm going to be when the show airs. Regular listeners know that I often go out to a little remote island in Lake Michigan called Garden Island during the summer. And it's been a place where I've gone for the last 40 years or so. And it's been a wonderful experience in terms of getting in touch with nature, getting to live a primitive camping life. And one of the most valuable lessons is just how few resources it actually takes to be happy, in order to create, to feed yourself, to keep yourself, and as long as you've got friends and you can entertain yourself, you don't need all this electronic stuff, he says, as he's speaking to you through electronic stuff. But This is also a very sad trip for me this year because the group that I am with, Midiskittigan Drum, we are losing our camp there that we've had for over 50 years. The island is almost all owned by the Department of Natural Resources, Michigan Department of Natural Resources. And they have pulled our permit. And so this may be the last year I get to go up to Garden Island for the summer. And in fact, part of what I'm doing is removing all the stuff that belongs to us. We got to empty out the cabins and the storehouses that we have things that we've had things up there for 50 years, as we say. It also makes me think about how the island itself has changed over those 40 years. The Lake Michigan has gotten much warmer. It used to be incredibly frigid, even when we went up there in August. The bird species, there's fewer of them. Last year I noticed that starlings, European starlings, have moved onto the island in a big way. Used to be you'd always count on being able to see some loons, some rare birds, and some rare species. And now we're not seeing that kind of stuff anymore. The island, even though it's remote, is becoming a lot more like the mainland. And this is not unique to Midiskittigan Drum, this idea that sort of an organization, people are getting older, things are changing, and not always for the better. And it's just really sad to see. So I will be thinking about you folks while I'm up there on the island. And there's still plenty that's beautiful up there, even though from the beach you can see across Lake Michigan to the northern peninsula, the upper peninsula. And as the years have gone by, the number of trees on the opposite shore has declined, and the number of things that have lights on them, like docks and radio towers, have increased. And so it's almost like a light show now. When I first went out there some 40 years ago, there was literally only one blinking light on the horizon, and now there's dozens. So I'm hoping to still see some really beautiful stuff. When the northern lights get going up there, it's really incredible. Unfortunately, the last several years, the horizon has been obscured by haze from Canadian wildfires, and it might well be that way again this year. Let's hope not. But I'm not sure exactly where I was going with all this musing, but I just want you folks to know why I'm not live in studio on Father's Day. I'll be live, hopefully, on a primitive island, cooking over a fire and working my butt off. So I'll be back next week. Look forward to seeing you folks. This is Joe DeMar signing off.
I don't want no oil, a spoil in my shoreline. I like fish much better than crud. I like birds and things a-creeping and crawling. Won't trade no more oil for blood. The sun done give us all we need to make this country run. But that black demon oil's got us fussing and fighting, and I do believe it's time we was done. I don't want them nukes run by them kooks who think radioactivity is fun. No more three-headed frogs or kids with leukemia. Nuclear power ain't fit for a dog. The sun